Torej, prvo začnem kar v slovenščini, vas vse lepo pozdravljam in bomo šli naprej v angleščini, zato ker imamo mednarodne goste in snemamo za YouTube, vi ne boste v sliki, tako da pač ste lahko varni in ideja je, da to posnamemo in da v bistvu tudi je dostopno na YouTubu in bo doživeti za vse nas. Okay, so I just welcome all of you on this side and those who are on Zoom. Thank you very much to be here with us today, and the idea is to have actually a special way of a lecture that is a presentation of the book. And this presentation of the book, it's done with intervention or small, let's say, lectures, really lectures that are very, very synthesized and talks about the text published in the book. So what is about? It's about this book here in front of us with the title Reactivating Critical Thinking in the Midst of Necropolitical Realities. It has also a sub-element, and this is for radical change. The book is a volume that we edit. We are me, Marina Gržinić, and my colleague, Jovita Pristovšek. Just briefly, we are working at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. We are working partly, I work at the ZRC SAZU at the Institute of Philosophy. We are colleagues in many projects and work on many books. So this book, Reactivating Critical Thinking in the Midst of Necropolitical Realities for Radical Change, I like to repeat the title. It's a volume with 24 authors. It was published recently, and it was published for Cambridge Scholars Publishing. The idea is to have a series of presentations. Actually, we already started in Slovenian language in a very small but important presentation group. And then we went to Vienna. There it was another presentation, and this time we decided to come back and to use what the 21st century allows to us, and this is to actually record this also for YouTube. So to give a chance that this book that just started a voyage, travel toward the public will be also accessible and will be possible to, through YouTube, get the first information. Today with us for the presentation, it's 8 authors, and this is our main goal and the most important thing. The authors that will join us, I would like immediately to welcome them. Some are already with us, others will come. So it's Lucrecia, Masson, Córdoba from Spain. Nina Cvar is here from Slovenia, and we are very thankful to Nina to be physically in this space. Then it's Liliana Conlisk Gallegos from US, Tjaša Kancler from Spain, Saša Kesić from Serbia, Stanimir Panayotov from Russia or being based in Russia, Joshua Simon from Israel, and Šefik Tatlić from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So what is the book about? Very shortly, it's about this idea to capture what means necropolitics, and necropolitics that today it's everywhere almost present as a term, as a notion that was coined by Achille Mbembe in 2003. It's actually a notion that say very simple. It's organized the social life saying who may live and who must die. This has an implication, this necropolitical grip, and necro means death, so the death that has a grip over life means a governmentality in which life is subsumed under this element of violence, enmity, war, predation, and we can see this very clearly all around us. So it's only what was necessary was the invention of Achille Mbembe in 2003 from Africa saying biopolitics is not enough. Necropolitics is the term that maybe can take us to a future and show to us what's going on. What is this necropolitics also? It's not just a symbolic, the big idea of death taking over life. This is cozy, it was modernistically very well exploited, but is actually also connected with what is the real of capital. That means making profit precisely through war, through death, accumulation of money through actually disposable bodies and so on. So this is the idea of the book. How we read this necropolitical, where we can find this, and practically it's everywhere. And then something utopian until the end, what can be a radical change, if this is possible to be present and we can think about a radical change. Who are those who help us to publish this book? Because this book with Jovita has a lot of institutions in the back. First is the Cambridge Scholars Publishing and the editor, Adam Rumens. Then is, of course, the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Science and Arts. And it's also the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And many friends, really friends who contributed, who helped us, but also it's a specific research program here at the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Science and Arts, and this is actually the research program with the title Boundary Configurations in Philosophy, Politics and Psychoanalysis. And this research is situated in the Institute of Philosophy. So this is why we are here. This is our, let's say, central place from which we want to present this book, and we want to open this discussion.
There was another friend who helped us with the cover image, with a drawing, and this is contemporary visual artist Vesna Bukovec. She did a special drawing from this book. She has made several drawings on the theme of protest, highlighting the messages that express a vision and hope for actually a better future. The volume, Reactivating Critical Thinking in the Midst of Necropolitical Realities for Radical Change, springs from the desire and need to rethink notions of space, time, and subject of agency, but along the structures of racialized violence that persist to this day and have been exposed more presently by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the starting point of this volume is actually the question of whether there is a pluriversal generation, a group of scholars who do not necessarily collaborate or know each other, but who are currently forming a radical structure that is viral in thought production and reflective on the current global recalibration of social relations brought about by the necropolitical and necrocapitalist governmentality. This has not only accelerated inequalities, many of which are deeply rooted in colonial history, but also nullified the conditions of life and completely negated the meaning of life as such. Some of us have never met in person. We met on Zoom or other digital connections. But what unites this axis, it stretches between Mexico, former Yugoslavia, Spain, Germany, Israel, and Japan, are the writings and practices that strive to show, as Achille Mbembe stated, despite differences, the worlds that could coexist in mutual recognition. So we have 24 positions assembled in the volume who transcend geographical boundaries, conceive the world as a single entity, and develop strategies for radical change. We presented them in 5 sub-chapters with 2 lines of demarcation. One is for entry, invention, and potentiality, and the other for a grim threshold. This collection brings together a generation of writers from an axis of radical philosophical and critical thought.
So maybe what are the main questions that we open with this volume before we really go with our guests? Some of the questions are, what are the ways, strategies, and modes of conceptualizing change? Because for radical change is the element that is key for the book. Can difference be made tangible, and how? Exist any difference, or we are, as he said, all in the same? Can we free ourselves from the modernist notions of emancipation? Is emancipation enough to be really something that leads us to a change? Can we act on the terrain of necropolitical realities themselves? For example, what is necropolitics? Assange will be extradited to US. No? This is a necropolitical act. Clear as cannot be more clear, and somebody said, is this possible in the time where everybody talk about freedom of mass media, and so on and so on? And what content and form would this agency take? This is also something that make us thinking. So the volume is a compilation of writings, quotations, thoughts, and images that actually try to disrupt the necrospace. This is also something that is coming from necropolitics. Or we want actually to think about forms also of collectivity and non-relationality. Not everything can be relational. Not everybody can be in relation to the other. As, for example, a theoretician, Axele Carrera, said once. She said, maybe non-relationality is the new relation, but that doesn't mean that we cannot build a community. So these are some ideas and some thoughts, and I would like now immediately to go with our first presenter, and this is Liliana Conlisk Gallegos from US. She is an associate professor at California State University, San Bernardino, and also an artist. So Liliana, please to take the floor, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to congratulate and thank Marina Gržinić and Jovita Pristovšek for this invitation and their wonderful work on this timely book. I also want to thank the colleagues who I will share space here today with, and I'm excited to meet you and hopefully get to know you all. My presentation is composed of experts from my chapter, reorganized, and I hope that this is okay. I'm grateful to the Yahaviatam Serrano First Nation and to all Indigenous First Nations who remain unrecognized, whose unceded, stolen, traditional Indigenous homelands I call home and have called home. More than an acknowledgement, this is a demand to give land back and respect Indigenous sovereignty, and a demand that the forced fragmentation, suppression, dehumanization, and cutting down of Indigenous lands, knowledges, and peoples of the Americas is acknowledged as what it is, a genocide, an extended Holocaust that continues to take place under the matrix of colonial power, the current global necropolitical telos that continues to function in detriment of a majority for the benefit of an extreme minority privileged by white supremacy in all of its forms. I grew up in Tijuana and San Isidro, in San Diego County. This US-Mexico border area is composed of what appears to be fragments, snippets, giving the effect of a kaleidoscope in constant movement of hyper misrepresentations of Tijuana and the borderlands. They are and have been mostly produced and distributed through outsider-produced media, which misappropriated and hijacked our city's symbols and iconography to further perpetuate the influx of pleasure tourism from the US. This cemented the image of Tijuana as the devil's playground, a town of vice and sin. This phenomenon surrounding the maneuver of coloniality, that is hijacking, appropriation, and misrepresentation, is something that Tijuana is very familiar with. The ill representation, some of which are actually the result of neoliberal and gringo presence in the region, designed an effect of hyperrealism, which resulted in a matrix-like existence for border rights and transborder rights of the frontier, a neoliberal extension of settler Disneyland. With Tijuana being dependent on tourism to survive, the locals were forced to perform as avatars that fulfilled gringo racist stereotypes of the Mexican hyperreal. Tijuana streets resisted not the stereotype, but the poverty, we use dehumanization to our advantage. Come in, beautiful señorita, $2 beer. And you would never know he's playing you, taking your money, exaggerating his Speedy Gonzalez accent for your fantasy. Ill perceptions of the Mexican border were produced and reproduced transmedia and were passed on transgenerationally. In the US dominant ideology, these border representations came to represent all Mexicans, all of Latin Americans, as well as the entire so-called third world. Growing up transfronteriza, I witnessed what Membe referred to as new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead. Perpetually crossing borders demystified them to me. The daily crossings materialized and exposed the ways of the coloniality of the quotidian. Labeled as a woman of color in the US nation state, no matter how much I try to just do my thing, my passion and strength are hijacked and twisted by agents of supremacy who in the quotidian act of expressing microaggressive comments misunderstand my work and misrepresent my sense of agency as incivility, audacity, and bravado. Having to pay the price of harassment and bullying for being brave enough to be myself is evidentiary to the fact that such privileges are still not available to people like me without consequence. This is extremely frightening when historically white supremacists justified the lynching and murder of Mexicans because to them we were acting too Mexican, speaking Spanish too loudly, or reminding Anglos too defiantly of their Mexicanness. Parallels between the struggles of the colonized are in great part ignored, not only because of selective education and the way mass media is produced, but also the way that the information is interpreted and used politically, how tropes and symbols originally created to resist coloniality are actually used to perpetuate it. And in this paper, I explain this context further, but I also ask us to go beyond the concept of internalization into one that lays more responsibility on us as individuals, as more people of color enter institutions of coloniality, such as academia and mass entertainment in the US and the world. Individualism, decontextualization, oversimplification, hierarchical and binary thinking are all persistent elements of the logic of coloniality that is both cause and effect of the colonial matrix of power. 500 years plus of quotidian acts, ways of thinking, being, and doing by individuals emboldened and supported by the matrix of colonial power are yet to be fully exposed, recorded, and analyzed. We are less familiar with how self-proclaimed woke individuals may fall into the trap of performing liberation and allyship, approaching it as one does the capital good or gain, abusing the colonial discourse to help increase future production or prestige within the colonial matrix. With this, these individuals uphold the supremacy of the current hierarchical order at the cost of further marginalization and coloniality. The mere attempt at rising within the hierarchy of coloniality centers on limited and strictly scripted ideals, and the individual must think in terms of order and progress, pinnacles of Eurocentric modernity, which come with a format, logic, and attitude of individualism, binary oversimplification, decontextualization, and exceptionalism through the minimization, occlusion, and or active exclusion of other formats, other ways, knowledges, and experiences outside coloniality's goals. The limits of coloniality lie on the agency of the colonized fundamentally, and particularly on the actions of those actants working and enforcing or resisting the will of institutions. Sometimes as colonized individuals, our decisions are dedicated by our survival, but sometimes our decisions are dedicated by our comfort. To individually exercise and unconsciously perform the logic of coloniality for comfort or an upper hand is to further justify and proxy manifestations of the global matrix of colonial power. What does coloniality look like beyond survival in the perks of the quotidian? What are the complexities that lie behind manifestations of coloniality that are lost to a discourse that only focuses on the colonialist functions of institutions? How can border life experiences leading to transborder thinking help explore the role of individuals within the matrix of colonial power? How can the individual and the community find empowerment through a critical consciousness of quotidian coloniality when navigating institutions while subversively resisting to participate as an agent of supremacy? I invite to revisit and reconceptualize the complex input of the colonized individual as it is present in examples of the phenomenon of virtual, digital, and popular US mass media, which has been functioning as the main source of information or even the new school of the masses within current coloniality. I demonstrate the complex interplay of the coloniality of the quotidian in its manifestation with examples such as a critique of US African-American comedian Dave Chappelle in his last Netflix special titled The Closer, in which he comes out as Team TERF, trans, exclusionary, radical feminist. His discourse presupposes a divisive border between queer and Black struggles, though his intention may have been to speak to those liberals who are agents of supremacy when they hypocritically defend LGBTQI plus human rights while ignoring and thus perpetrating violence against Black and other people of color. A lack of context resulted in an internet explosion of mass confusion. Videos and posts made by white supremacists and other oppressed oppressors who wretchedly troll on any opportunity to climb up in the ideological hierarchical social ladder of coloniality continue to ignore the critique of white supremacy while uplifting only the selected part of Chappelle's comedic discourse that in their head further justified their punchdown of the transgender and LGBTQI human experience. Ironically, these supremacy hopefuls are doing exactly what Chappelle was critiquing the hypocrite liberal white supremacist society for. Grossly, they still continue to ignore his primary plight, that of a Black man fighting against white supremacy. His basic question was valid. Why is there so much white outrage and upset over LGBTQI plus marginalization as an issue of human rights? And yet there's still much silence about topics of racism, such as the incarceration and murder of Black and brown people by police and children in cages in the border. Yet, due to decontextualization, he was unable to question without further marginalizing the LGBTQI plus community with homophobic and transphobic jokes. This example was produced by a binary either-or mentality which emulates the hierarchical logic where Chappelle's initial controversy lies, individualism. Responsiveness is dependent on if the issue of marginalization, dehumanization touches individuals personally. This is a brief example of how quotidian coloniality functions as an extension that serves to uphold, in this case, transphobia. Scholars have hinted at the coloniality of the quotidian. For example, Yoruba scholar Oyeronke Oyewumi notes the experience of quotidian coloniality within gender violence in male-dominated circles. Mark Rifkin's Settler Common Sense takes note of the decontextualized structures of feeling vital in the ongoing performance of quotidian modes of inhabitants and selfhood. Like these scholars, I too, as a transfronteriza, hold specific resistant philosophical and mental processes that guide me into this reconceptualization. By sharing my lesser known niche perspective with a global audience, I seek to add my voice to show individuals living under the oppression of coloniality the ways in which we may unknowingly be serving as agents of the matrix of colonial power, supporting and enforcing coloniality and marginalization through incidents and acts which internalize and enact the binary and hierarchical formats of supremacy, even when we're claiming to be for liberation from coloniality. Hierarchical and binary ways of thinking and doing were widespread through communication tools such as mass media. While entertained, we are programmed to follow formats and ways of doing coloniality. The promise of access to power seduces into becoming a willful agent of the matrix, aspiring to advance and progress within the confines of the system, no matter the cost. Yet, thinking we can impose the logic of coloniality onto others and be liberated ourselves is like pissing into the wind. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire explains that those who support the colonization of the imaginary and follow it blindly are nothing more than oppressed oppressors. Maybe simply beginning to complexify our perspectives and expand our sensibility to the intricacy of the details of this phenomenon could serve as key to our broader liberation. Personally, I'm not interested in reaching the agents who consciously uphold the matrix of colonial power and supremacy in all its iterations. This, like most things that exist globally, is not about them. I care to reach those who uphold the matrix of colonial power unknowingly, unconscious of their agency, power, and the ways in which that same coloniality presents itself as their chosen or most convenient avatar in quotidian exchanges and experiences. Furthermore, this work is aimed to support all those who are oppressed, suppressed, attacked, and yet keep standing up to those agents and continue building the decolonial project toward liberation by carrying their days and each other in the struggle, always remembering that the context of coloniality keeps morphing and revamping, because in coloniality, we also are dealing with human experience toward death, where trauma reigns and memory becomes fragile. To those in the struggle who say they long for liberation, no matter how much you write and produce, no matter how much you theorize with critical discourse and provide strategies of global decoloniality, or how many people cite you, if you do not pay attention to the coloniality embedded in our quotidian interactions, if you gatekeep without allowing yourself to be further educated by alternative forms of expression and knowledge production, if you believe a discipline is superior to an expression of experience with coloniality, if you think you don't need to be decolonized and continuously strive for stardom in a dreamt of scholarly decontextualized decolonial supremacy, it's time to wake the fuck up. And please excuse my language throughout this piece. I am aware that my writing and expressions have become limited by the concepts and formats of coloniality in my academic formation. The struggle for liberation truly is ongoing. Siempre en la lucha. Thank you. Gracias.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Liliana, especially because I think the language is appropriate in the way how you use it and explain, because you talk and your chapter has this incredible title, The Coloniality of the Quotidian. That means practically the necropolitical that is in relations to coloniality coming in a certain way directly from our living rooms. And you talk about this transborder perspective of the matrix of colonial power and the agents of supremacy. So thank you very much for this, and we will go on now to the next speaker. This is Nina Cvar, just sitting near me. Nina Cvar is a researcher at the Faculty of Electrical Engineering, University of Ljubljana, and assistant at the Faculty of Arts, Department of Sociology, University of Ljubljana. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marina and Jovita, for inviting me to this collaboration and to be part of this wonderful publication. So my text titled Transformations from Capitalist Realism to Brutalist Neoliberal Necrocapitalism, the case of Slovenia in the period COVID-19. In my text, I wanted to explore and discuss some of the, let's say, constitutive social processes within the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially drawing on the authors like Mark Fisher, specifically on his notion of capitalist realism, and of course also Achille Mbembe's Necrocapitalism and Brutalism, however in reference to the case of Slovenia. Of course, other authors have been equally important for my research, to name just a few, Marina Gržinić, Balibar, Đorđe Agamben, Wendy Chun, and many others. So the main thesis that I wanted to explore in my text was obviously the so-called transformation of capitalist realism to brutal necrocapitalism, arguing that we are witnessing something what I would call the brutalist necrocapitalization of capitalist realism. In this manner, I divided my chapter into several sub-chapters, starting with restarting the state of exception, recalibrating all sovereign practices, genealogies of COVID-19, Agamben's non-operational COVID-19, or life is always political, and of course the case study of Slovenia as a, let's say, wonderful example of brutalist necrocapitalist violence. Only to conclude then with discussion of the position of the left, especially its status in relation to its own melancholy. But first things first, a little bit of a context. I'm starting my text with an interview from Alenka Zupančič given in 2020, arguing that, of course, the first lockdowns are something that have never been seen in recent history. And of course, this in a way fosters questions why this was even possible to take place. And it's important also to know that obviously this didn't happen in a, let's say, pure vacuum. And it should be considered, especially within the epistemic context of the figures of the end, especially in the context of the figure of, let's say, post-apocalypse. But more importantly, her question was important for me and for my work, especially in a manner to ask myself what enabled this closure, and obviously how we can put this within the context of the capitalists' mode of production. Did we perhaps experience something of an internal critique of capitalist realism? Or was it obviously something related to the complex discursive network of already claimed figures of post-apocalypse? Or to refer to Agamben in 2016, this is important, perhaps we were witnessing something of the specific judicial political machinery of the West as a biopolitical apparatus. However, to refer to Marina Gržinić's work and also to Achille Mbembe, obviously within the context of necrocapitalism. But what's important for my text is that it is occurring on, let's say, two major levels. The first level is the level of subjectivization. So what's the status of subjectivity in relation to late capitalism? And the second level is obviously the reproduction of capitalist mode of production. And the third, as already said, the problem of the leftist position and melancholy. If I go now to the level of subjectivity, here I would quote and refer to Mark Fisher's work in 2018 to 2009, especially his work on the conjuncture that emerged after 2008 credit crisis, which is obviously important, especially in terms of how the subjectivity is formed on one hand, and on the other hand, how is this relevant to the reproduction of capitalist matrix? And what's important in terms of the figuration of the subjectivity is obviously his notion of reflexive impotence. What this notion means is something that it's obviously that shouldn't be approached in terms of apathy or cynism, but should be approached as a perfect knowledge or reflexivity. And this is extremely important, especially in terms of something that Marina has spoken before in terms of political engagement after, let's say, brutalist necrocapitalism. And that is obviously something that should be taken into account when criticizing the concept of a biopolitical subject. And why, again, reflexive impotence? Because in a way it makes, in a way, a closure, and it also prevents it prevents how to think about alternative futures, how to think about, obviously, possibilities, the potentiality of, let's say, the coloniality itself. And in terms of, obviously, going to the context of COVID and Slovenia, this needs to be also contextualized within the regime of post-truth and fake news, which is something that obviously came to light, especially within the context of post-socialist countries, how obviously the pandemic was dealt. Just to continue with my text, what I'm also claiming in my text is also something that I would call the so-called uncanny neoliberal zombification of subjectivity, which is a direct result of the, let's say, something that also Fisher is stating, and that is obviously the death of neoliberalism. To quote Fisher, I do think that financial crisis killed neoliberalism as a political project, but this obviously doesn't need to be alive in order to continue to dominate our minds, end of quote. And this is extremely important point for my analysis, because in this respect, I'm claiming that this neoliberal zombification of subjectivity is obviously not only neoliberal, but also necropolitical. And it's best obviously represented in the context of COVID-19 and also in a somehow, let's say, bizarre situation where parts of the left political spectrum actually share the similar positions of the right in terms of how the pandemic was addressed, particularly in terms of its relation to issues of personal freedoms and general distrust in the social structure. as well. But obviously, before I continue with the analysis of the so-called capitalist mode of production, obviously, I would also like to give a definition of, short definition of necrocapitalism. And here I'm obviously referring to Marina's work, especially in terms how necrocapitalism is organizing processes of the whole capitalist accumulation, which is obviously occurring via death. And it is something that we can experiencing all the time and now directly in Europe with war raging in Ukraine. And what's important with necrocapitalism is obviously that Professor Gržinić is considering it as a contemporary form of capitalism. And again, it leads to a necrocapitalization of the whole social and production of the whole social milieu and production of specific forms of governmentality. So how does in this fit the concept of brutalization and brutalism from Mimbes? In the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, together with the contradictions of neoliberalism and specific mode of subjectivity, these epistemologies are the basis of what obviously Mimbe calls brutalism. It's important, obviously, also to say that Mimbe coined the concept of brutalism in the early 2020. But its contours of planarity and also its calls for, let's say, the deprovincialization of European universalism resonate obviously deeply with the current global environmental catastrophe, including obviously COVID-19. And the concept of brutalism allows Mimbe to describe capitalism as a continuous process of extraction and waste production. Above all, according to Mimbe, brutalism is a process of growth, but not only of walls, clean streets, prescribed medicines, cars and banks, but also as a process of growth of garbage, to quote Mimbe. Garbage made of human and inhuman remains which we bury, sent abroad or imprisoned in incineration islands or plastics or migrants that have no value in our economic system are examples of this exponential trashization of the world. End of quote. So in my text, I'm trying to connect these levels, so necrocapitalism, brutalism, but also I try to connect them to the structural logic of extractivism. And again, extractivism can be witnessed in all spheres of social reality, not just, for instance, in data extraction, in extraction of humans, of obviously environment itself. And in the context of COVID pandemic, obviously COVID-19 calls into the question some of the most fundamental concepts in these areas, not just, let's say, the whole rethinking of capitalist mode of production, but also notions of democracy, models of governance, and obviously the constitution itself. And what is the most important is obviously to underline that the concept of life is obviously always political and thus subjected to mediated relationship between subject and object. So let us now look at the case study of Slovenia during the COVID-19, which again is unfortunately a prime example of how these processes are functioning in today's contemporary times. So after the resignation of Prime Minister Marjan Šarec at the end of January 2020, the new right-wing Slovenian government led by Janez Janša took office on 13th of March. And at the, let's say, inaugural meeting, the cabinet of ministers wore these filter masks, which were at that time virtually impossible to obtain. But with the obviously staged photo, it seems that this newly formed government wanted to continue the story of Janša as a politician who excels in crisis. However, the photo could also be understood as a, let's say, introduction to the course of the grim socio-political events that followed. So immediate invocation of state of emergency, but especially with a more, let's say, fervent motivation to destroy basically all branches of government and other vital social systems of Slovenian society. Of course, Janša's politics has always been right-wing, disguising their neoliberal character. But within the COVID times, obviously, this only intensified. However, it's also important to know that this necropolitical governmentality manifested itself in what I would obviously call the zombification of subjectivity, which in the context of COVID-19, obviously, on one hand, rejected actions to, let's say, address the disease at the individual level, but on the other hand, obviously, it was wrapped up as a bureaucratic logic of management under the banner of medical triage. And of course, there were many cases, but most grim was obviously the case of nursing homes. Nursing home residents, at least in the first wave of pandemics, were severely affected. But again, not only because of years of neoliberal neglect and management policies that failed to provide enough beds and professional staff, basically leaving families literally on their own to care for their elderly members, but also, as a critically acclaimed Slovenian magazine Mladina reported, through creation of special lists that determine in advance who can receive hospital treatment or not. Just to conclude, the most important, obviously, question is how to get out. How to get out of this grim reality, which is not only, let's say, necropolitical, but is brutalistically necropolitical. The only way probably is through this opening of possibilities, but this opening obviously should probably follow the terms what actually means to be human. And this meaning obviously needs to surpass the regime of white bourgeois European men, wrapped in its own rationality, obviously serving as a kernel for colonial modernity and obviously also colonizing what it means to be human, to refer to Sylvia Winter. So it seems that with the COVID-19, we were literally asked and urged to ask ourselves, what actually does human mean? So this would be my final thought.
Thank you, Nina. And actually, it's very interesting because I was thinking how we came from Liliana, Mexico, US, point of really what she says, it's a colonial matrix of power that completely through supremacy, it's making the diversification and unification of bodies, and it's expanding this from the quotidian to actually Slovenia. So we are not outside, but I think sometimes as you present very well also with this reference to the leftist melancholy, we cannot think about supremacy, we cannot think about these levels because being very much connected with the idea of the nation state. Thank you. I think we can go on with Šefik Tatlić, that it's somebody who is living as freelance, living in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but is that means has a specific overview on the possibilities of theory, life, and also the status of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is a prominent theorist in the fields of political philosophy and also one of the pioneering persons regarding decolonial theory in the realm of former Yugoslavia and much wider. So, Šefik, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Marina. And thank you, everyone, and hello once again. My text is called Sociocide / Progress, Critical Thinking in the Age of Necrocapitalism. Basically, this text aimed to detect certain fields or domains of thinking. Paradigmatic critical thought is not properly or adequately tackling in the age of necrocapitalism, as well as to define those concepts within the confines of which are themselves being radically transfigured and devastated by necropolitics as a paradigm of the organization of power. Speaking of the critique of critique, this text hypothesizes that many critical narratives still imply that society and subjectivity exist, but that they are subjugated and or repressed by a various institutional, ideological, and epistemic mechanisms of neoliberal global necrocapitalism, which prevent them from being exercised or applied. A similar situation also applies to a perpetual reproduction and glorification of the notion of progress, which has been recognized as a construct that stems from the register of colonial epistemology and white Eurocentric modernity, but still continues to figure as a prominent kind of an answer to reactionary populism and fascism and attached retrograde ideologies. Differently put, the text critically addresses both an implication that society exists and that it only needs to structure itself politically, and an implication that subjectivity as something semi-independent or inherently detached from hegemonic epistemology exists, and that it needs to be connected with the previously mentioned political structuralization of that spectral, ghostly society. Additionally, and ultimately, the text detects the notion of progress as an epistemic framework that does not generate new radical approaches to defining and producing society and subjectivity, but that pacifies these two concepts by, metaphorically said, embalming them, preserving them as corpses from decay, and that it facilitates the glorification of these corpses exactly under the aura of celebration of social vitality, represented as an antipod, an answer to necropolitics. Specifically speaking, sociocide is in this text articulated as a complex ideological and pseudo-political process, the main trait of which is exactly to deny the political character of society. As it has been articulated, sociocide is both an ongoing process and an end result of reactionary, both conservative and neoliberal policies that equate the mere presence of ethnically, racially, and religiously defined population and or nation with society. This text postulates that ethnicity is not society and the nation is not society. An example of this in the daily political register can be seen in the Balkans, for example, where the genocidal Greater Serbia or Serb World Project and the ethno-nationalists, for example, in Croatia, Hungary, and Russia, continue to define the state, its institutions, and its borders as an extension of biologically defined nation. Of course, something very similar can be seen in the recent case of exercise of Russian ethno-nationalist imperialism, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, under the aura of which there is an open denial of possibilities of the concepts of state, borders, and institutional frameworks as something political, something that could and should transcend biologically and ethnically defined nation. Speaking in wider terms, the statements and denotations which saw the society as dead, like probably the most famous such statement that came from Margaret Thatcher, and which were and are coming almost exclusively from the register of the right-wing and neoliberal ideological spectrum should be taken seriously, but also used constructively in order for society as a concept to be redefined and politically and ideologically reinvigorated. But in order for something like that to happen, the death of society should be embraced, which, as the text suggests, also allows or would allow a detection of maybe the most nefarious characteristic of necropolitics, its vitalism. In other words, necropolitics is in this text detected not only as a paradigm of power that terminally kills, but that also preserves the undead character of politically and ideologically potent concepts in order to prevent their reincarnation. Following on the observations of society as dead, the text hypothesizes that a human subject, i.e. subjectivity, hasn't only been reduced to more or less disposable commodity, but it has as a biological shell or configuration which might contain subjectivity, reduced onto a mere shell, so mere flesh. Of course, this doesn't in any way mean that certain universalism has been established among the iterations of this flesh, but it means that both biopolitical and necropolitical matrices of primarily race-based, but also class-based differentiation and subjugation are being applied to these formations of flesh, which have now, on the basis of sociocide, completely substituted society. White flesh, of course, remains the most privileged form of flesh, while other kinds of flesh are expected to try to achieve the status of embellished flesh, discarding along the way all the histories of racial oppression in the name of emancipation, which has practically become a process of becoming embellished flesh. In relation to the hegemony of image in the context of the reproduction of the collapse of not just critical discourse, but a discourse itself, the text postulates that it is not only a mere image, but that it is a resolution, technologically negotiated sharpness and richness of an image, an embellished image, that became a primary space for the enunciation of subjectivity. This impetus towards embellishment is a manifestation, but also a content of totalitarian ideological and epistemic process, which is producing a mere, of course, embellished presence of flesh as a token of the supposed existence of subjectivity and its placement in the historical time, which itself has been dehistoricized and depoliticized, as well as configured only to revolve around the necropolitical deadness represented as social interaction. As a recent example, for example, it is maybe a blunt example, but still a useful one. There was recently a case in which one of the globally recognizable celebrities, known practically for nothing, used Marilyn Monroe's dress, a mere act of wearing a piece of cloth on flesh, as an attempt at subjectivizing herself, and presumably as an attempt at inscription into the historical register. Otherwise, the reduction of the population onto flesh is conducted by both the biopolitical and necropolitical matrices. Biopolitics takes care that differentiation among the forms of flesh gets recognized as emancipation, while necropolitics is providing necrocapitalism with sovereign subjectivity by reproducing differentiation as an act of imposition of death upon those particularities and territories not worthy of embellishment. So in regards to the notion of progress, the living death of progress, as it was dubbed in the chapter subtitle, This notion has, of course, been widely criticized by decolonial theoreticians and decoded as part of white colonial epistemology. But as it is suggested in the text, it still hasn't been radically dismantled. More specifically speaking, there are still those aspects entailed within the notion which are implying that some authentic human, or even worse, humanist kernel is still at the core of human proto-subjectivities, or at the core of humanity as such. This naturalization of proto-political and proto-historic propensities of humanity is, as argued, a huge problem, the origins of which are in Eurocentric colonial epistemology, and in this specific case, in these presumptions on the existence of something authentically human are actually in direct correlation to the coloniality of power as a contemporary form of the perpetuation of colonial epistemology. The dominant ideological and epistemic implication that stands behind the notion of progress, as well as behind the processes of sociocide and the reduction of the population onto flesh, is the denial of the artificial character of politics, history, and, in the lack of a better term, the humanity itself. Progress as a movement forward under the terms of the dominance of necrocapitalism and within the framework of history that does not happen politically and ideologically, is therefore a kind of dynamism based on a presumption that historical movement is a process of unveiling, uncovering, rediscovering, or as the neoliberalism would suggest, deregulating and freeing supposedly authentic potentials of humanity. I would argue that these potentials have already been uncovered and freed, which practically led to the normalization of necropolitics. And if this situation is to be tackled, if this regime of power is to be tackled, everything, especially those concepts and configurations of thought, living and historical, that are regarded as non-artificial, have to be decoded / articulated as utterly artificial. When and if this applies to the definition of politics, subjectivity, society, and history, I would argue only then society, subjectivity, politics, and history will become producible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Šefik, also because you expose this vitalism of necropolitics. And I think it's very specific for ex-Yugoslavia, also in this relation of the glorification of the genocide in Srebrenica by Serbia and Serbian authorities, Republika Srpska. There we see this vitalism. Now I would like that we continue with Stanimir Panayotov, that it's here with us, and Stanimir Panayotov is now living in Russia. It's an assistant professor in philosophy at the School of Advanced Studies in University of Tyumen. Please correct me, Stanimir, if the pronunciation is not the right one, and I give you the floor.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. I'm very excited to see all of you. Some of you I know, some I'm yet to meet in person. I'm grateful to the editors for the invitation. I've worked with them on a couple of other occasions. It's always a challenge, a conceptual challenge, so to speak. So I'm gonna present some basic chunks from my text, from my contribution, which, as you can see, is called Death for Itself. But that's not going to be a very linear presentation. I just want share some major highlights from the text, and I'll be also interjecting some other comments in the meantime. I want to say that one thing that happens every time I work on that is I remind myself that I always remind myself I arrived at this line of work, namely necropolitics, more or less gratuitously and by chance, because I've never really had a hope to have some kind of substantial say in this classroom, so to speak, and raise a hand. When in 2014 Šefik and Marina's book was published, I decided there's something very important happening there. And what followed was a series of publications that are all interconnected. And in fact, what I'm presenting today and what's included in the present volume is sort of like the kind of last text in this sequence where I arrive at a particular standstill, and I do believe that's where this line ends. But I want to highlight again that this entire work started with a review essay on Šefik and Marina's book back in 2014. Then I published a text which I also presented on several occasions, which was called the Reserve Debt Army. And now this is the kind of final installment of this sequence where I elaborate a theory that's probably slightly more consolidated, but it also speaks to a kind of larger context and audience, I believe, even though it has its specificities. And one thing I want to continue on is that this text is in some ways a kind of very adversely and advanced response to the origins of necropolitics, namely Mbembe's engagement with Hegel and Bataille in his original essay. But here I do believe I don't engage with Bataille, but only with the Hegel here. But what I'm effectively saying in this text is quite different, and it's not to the effect of Mbembe's conclusions. One other thing I want to just highlight briefly before I proceed with some of the quotations and the slides is this point about radicality that the editors were making at the very outset of this panel, of this event today, is that I do believe we're in a place where rethinking radicality and radical politics is via tropes of necropolitics is I mean, I think in one way it probably already happened, but there is another way in which there's more time needed for people, activists and scholars and otherwise to realize the extent to which radicality is in a kind of standstill, and that's not something necessarily evil and bad. I do believe that I'm contributing with this text to a very kind of skeptical notion of radical politics, where we need to sit seriously and think about our exit strategies and possible political successes ahead of us in the light of the dark, so to speak, right? So that's not necessarily something bad. All right. So the major point that I'm making in this text has to do with Hegel's system, which he elaborates in the Greater Logic. And there are three moments in this system, which is the for itself, the in itself, the for itself, and the in for itself. However, what I'm doing with it is something that I call that for itself. And so in this text, I developed the notion of that for itself as the highest point of the necropolitical justification of human expendability. I argue that there is a necropolitical hyper-rationalization of dying that closes the final chapter of liberal communist utopias. So you can say it's clearly that, in this text, what I'm doing is, in a sense, very banal. It's yet another nail in the coffin of liberalism, and there's nothing original about that. Or surprising. Rather, what I'm trying to unearth by developing this notion of death for itself is that there's something about the opposition, life and death, that has gone completely haywire. And I do believe that even well-meaning liberal thinkers and politicians nowadays don't seem to grasp that. They don't seem to understand that what happened in the juxtaposition between life and death. And this is where I'm going with developing this concept. And so briefly about what the hypothesis is here, is that the hypothesis is that the necropolitical regime we're currently immersed in, and here we have two positions from Foucault's Make Live and Let Die to Gržinić and her articulation of Let Live and Make Die. This is in the book I mentioned, has mummified and thus invalidated the middle concept of Hegel's doctrine, the for itself. And this doctrine, again, consists of his doctrine of the idea, so-called idea, which is tripartite, as usual with Hegel. It's in itself, the for itself, and the in and for itself. So the reason why this concept gains for me importance is that the essence of the for itself, which is the middle stage of the development of the idea, demonstrates a composite solubility that is indispensable for finitude. Finitude, in turn, is indispensable for the intentional horizon of both life and death, emanating in the final stage of the in and for itself. Now, without such a finitude, a corruptive form of insolubility of dying takes the center stage of all life, squashed as it is in the form of stasis vacui. That for itself is thus fully developed and self-comprehending. I call it death by insolubility. Okay. So what I'm effectively saying is there's a kind of corruption going on in the tripartite structure of Hegel's doctrine of being, and I take it seriously because this is a very elegantly integrated doctrine within some form of liberal theorizations, but it also has to do with the concept of life, because the doctrine of idea in the greater logic eventually is a contribution to a concept of life. And this is effectively why I'm interested in looking up at Hegel from a necropolitical perspective. So what I'm saying here is that the corruption of this triad arrives as the condition of rethinking the thinkable of life. So there is a chunk of life that's thinkable and a chunk of life that isn't. It delimits the thinking of the unthinkable itself. The unthinkable is no longer a camp of political rationality to which a theoretical no-border policy adheres. Here I refer to the work of Elizabeth Blagojevich. The unthinkable becomes the premise of this rationality. A fusion of necropolitics and unthinkability emanates, and it is choreographed in the suspension of life as the political cornerstone of the viability of the liberal nation state. So there is a kind of policy level, if you will, of this kind of theorization, which has to do with the implementation of the opposite of death, which is life itself. And I'll explain where I'm going with this in a moment. Now, I claim that in this text, I claim something that's very crucial, and here I didn't include it in the slide, but I have to intervene here before I go on with this slide. One of the things I've been claiming for the past few years, very much with the help of Marina Gržinić and Šefik Tatlić's work, is that there is a particular form of Western privilege of looking at necropolitics, and that privilege comes from the assumption that biopolitics is something that's universal, at least to the Eurocentric world. I think it's fair to say that's not true. I've been trying to show this in my previous text, called Deserve That Army, and here I try to emanate this point. So I effectively claim, with the help of other authorities, that when it comes to Eastern Europe, we can very much say that you have at least one, I think more than one, but at least one region in the world where you can prove that necropolitics is not preceded by biopolitics. And I do claim that despite the differences in post-socialist transition societies, especially in Eastern Europe, there is kind of Western gazing at necropolitics that falsely assumes the preceding step of biopolitics. And I forgot to say, of course, there is another text I published, which is called Necropolitics in the East, and it's part of this line of text. Sorry, I missed that one. So in that particular text, I developed this point much further. So here, what I'm saying, based on this kind of reasoning, is that there is a way we can actually conceptualize what this privilege does. And one of the functions of this notion of debt for itself is precisely descriptive of that privilege. What I'm saying is that debt for itself emerges as a concept that is rationally repeatable and transferable to politics. The corruption of the triadic structure in the Hegel system is just a dramatic blow. This corruption seizes upon the social dynamic of debt itself, ultimately mummifying social transformability and change. And in this way, that becomes the only positive value of politics. But that's something I don't think I don't think a lot of philosophers, theoreticians, or even politicians actually do think about this problem. And that's where I'm going with this text. I want to highlight that we are kind of in this weird loop where we are kind of assuming that life precedes politics. But there's plenty of evidence already from the 1970s onwards that's not the case. There's a case I'm making, especially with respect to Eastern European intelligentsia, that very often repeats this liberal elitist argument. What are you talking about with this necropolitics? This is just one of those sham concepts of the neoliberal theory about neoliberalism. It's not very comfortable, doesn't fit well with our Eastern European realities. This is alien Western Marxism. This is just some kind of conceptual crap and doesn't describe social economic realities of the region. I claim that this argument could never answer the simple question as to what was the point of globalization and economic integration in the fall of communism, if the local liberal intelligentsias reject concepts like neoliberalism. I think my time is up now.
In a certain way, it's true, but maybe a conclusion.
Yeah, no, because I also time myself, so I can just say a couple of sentences and I'll be done.
Yes.
If that's fine, okay. So anyway, I have more slides than that's necessary, but I like the format of not reading all through the time. But I just want to wrap up by saying that by the end of this text, I don't offer any solution. This text is in a sense very descriptive. This notion of debt for itself has a descriptive function. It doesn't have a transformative function. I don't mean it in that way. I do believe that conceptual desperation can probably lead people to transform their thinking. But in this particular case, I'm not that sure that this is the case. And I think there is a particular conceptual and political standstill that my notion of debt for itself describes. And I hope if you dig deeper into the text, that will speak better for everyone. So thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Stanimir, for this reflection. I think it's very needed, especially for the place from which we are speaking, and this is Slovenia. That is a case in se, as already Nina pointed, and then Šefik make like a turn about ex-Yugoslavia and a very specific way how necropolitical is working. Now I would like to welcome Lucrecia, Masson, Córdoba, writer, artist, and transdisciplinary researcher, doctoral candidate in philosophy at the University of Zaragoza, and a member of the collective ILU. And hello, Lucrecia. This is the first time that we see each other, and I think you have an idea that maybe Tjaša will translate your thoughts. So I would like also to welcome Tjaša And thank you very much for this effort. Besides, after you will also, Tjaša, present your paper. So I give you the floor to you both for your thoughts and Tjaša translation.
Hi, can you hear me? Just checking sound.
Excellently.
Okay, perfect. Hello to all. Let's continue.
Okay, thank you, Marina. Thank you, Tjaša, too. Hola a todos, gracias. Voy a hablar en español y Tjaša muy amablemente va a traducirme y agradezco esto porque, bueno, me facilita mucho este momento, esta presentación, para hablarles un poco de mi capítulo.
So Lucre is saying hello to everyone and thank you for the translation, which will facilitate the talk that she will give in relation to her article.
Sí. Bueno, mi contribución para este libro es un texto, son dos textos, ¿no? Dos piezas llamada Epistemología Rumiante y Mondongo Exercise.
So Lucre's contribution for this book consists of two parts. On the one hand is Ruminant Epistemology, a text written in 2015, and the second part is Mondongo
Exercise, ¿no?
Exercise, yeah, Mondongo Exercise.
Sí, y Epistemología Rumiante es un texto escrito en 2015 y lo que hago es y justamente habla de rumia, entonces lo que hago es una revisita, un descarnar, un desmenuzar ese texto y propongo por lo tanto este ejercicio mondongo, este Mondongo Exercise, donde lo que hago es un regurgitar.
So what she's proposing on the basis of this first text written in 2015, it's an exercise where to break down, revisit the previous work, so it is therefore a regurgitation.
Justamente eso es lo que me interesa, o sea, ahí está el acento que pongo, que es en ese ejercicio estomacal, ese regurgitar, que implica volver a masticar lo pastado.
It is therefore a stomachaal exercise where you go back to chewing what has been grazed.
La epistemología rumiante se basa, o sea, pone la atención, pone el acento en esa rumia que hacen los animales rumiantes, y lo que me interesa ahí es la lentitud, el sentido de la lentitud, cómo es el motor, ahí la lentitud, y el paso de un estómago a otro.
So the ruminant epistemology proposes to pay attention to the exercise of rumination, since there is this slow passage from one stomach to another. And can you repeat, Lucre,
Sí.
¿puedes repetir la
Sí,
última parte?
La lentitud es el motor y es esta idea de del paso de un estómago a otro.
So
Sí.
the lengthness, the slowness of all this
Sí.
process is the crucial point in these passages.
Y es la lentitud y es el paso de un estómago a otro. Son 4 estómagos, el estómago rumiante se compone de 4 estómagos y lo que se hace es un paso de un estómago a otro y hay un sentido espiralado casi.
So it's about to pay attention to the organization of the stomachs, in sense of ruminant animals have 4 stomachs, and to put an emphasis to precisely this passage from one stomach to another.
Este ejercicio, ¿no? Este ejercicio de rumia tiene esa forma espiralada o casi espiralada, pero básicamente tiene algo como de ir, volver, estacionar, y me interesa porque ofrece una posibilidad de huida de la linealidad.
So this exercise, which is surely in a spiral form, offers a possibility of, in a way, escaping from linearity.
Ujú. Y no presenta además claramente principios y finales, ¿no? O sea, están de alguna manera desdibujados el principio y el final en esta acción. O sea, hay todo el tiempo un ir, volver y volver a masticar.
The important aspect is also there are not clearly definable lines of beginnings and endings in all these flows and processes.
Y la lentitud es parte de esta propuesta epistemológica inspirada o mirando la rumia, el rumiante, porque es esa lentitud la que favorece la nutrición, ¿no? La que de alguna manera posibilita la nutrición, el alimento.
In addition, the slowness is important to think because it favors nutrition, since rumiation it's a process which there is a continuous turning, spiral directions, and slowness in this part.
Aunque el alimento no sea de alta calidad, el pasto es la lentitud lo que posibilita el aprovechar el máximo de esos nutrientes.
So it's precisely the slowness that take advantage of the food and in terms of quality and nutrition.
Y para realizar este trabajo, o sea, para pensar en esto, realizo un trabajo de observación lenta con vacas y tiene que ver con que me crié, o sea, con mi infancia entre vacas.
So to do this work, I observe the way all these functions in relation to cows and everything that surrounds them, which is also related to her experience of a childhood.
Sí. Y el territorio donde esto sucede, digamos, del lugar de donde estoy hablando, de estas vacas, es en la región norte de la Patagonia, comienzo de la Patagonia, en lo que a día de hoy se llama Argentina.
And the space, the territory where or to which all this thinking is related and the experience is a region, north region of Patagonia.
Sí, y entonces tiene que ver con esa mirada, con eso que sucede desde la infancia, ¿no? O sea, con una mirada atenta y lenta en la que luego he seguido trabajando y he pasado, o sea, he buscado que sea de una observación lenta, buscando experimentar con el tiempo, ¿no? O sea, ¿qué pasa con el tiempo vaca?
So from this experience of slow observation and also childhood experiences, all this is drawn together in this work. And Lucre, I lost it again, the last sentence.
Sí, que he experimentado con ese tiempo lento, o sea, buscando hacer una experiencia con ese tiempo vaca, o sea, ¿qué pasa si habito un tiempo lento, un tiempo vaca?
So the most important is also to think about this experience of slow timing, like a cow timing.
Sí, y entonces acá en todo esto lo que me interesa es la vaca, o sea, pensar en la vaca hay toda una dimensión ahí del insulto gorda, o sea, el insulto de gorda como vaca.
So the word cow is also related to the insult coming from gordofobia, fat phobia.
Sí, entonces ahí hay eso que tiene que ver con con la vaca en tanto cuerpo, un cuerpo excesivo, y a su vez en cuanto a lo lento y lo pesado, ¿no?
So it has to do with the body of the cow in terms of slowness, dimension, and ¿qué decías lo último?
Pesado, o sea, lento y pesado.
And heavy, and heavy.
Sí. Bueno, entonces, básicamente estos son los asuntos que suceden en ese primer texto, epistemología rumiante. Eso es todo lo que se propone, buscando una propuesta poética, una propuesta de una epistemología impura y una epistemología que es poética también.
So these are the crucial aspects in this first part of the text related to ruminant epistemology. And it's about impure epistemology
y poética.
And poetic.
Y bueno, entonces en el segundo texto hago ese regurgitar, ese revisitar, pasando por estos 4 estómagos rumiantes.
And in the second text, Mondongo Exercise, it's an exercise related to regurgitation, where the text passes through these 4 stages, 4 stomachs, the rumen, reticulum, omasum, and abomasum.
Exacto. esos 4 estómagos. Y bueno, a partir de este texto, de esta segunda pieza, me interesa buscar una escritura donde a su vez visito eso anterior, donde buscar experimentar ese regurgitar, ¿no? O sea, de lo que tanto he hablado, a ver qué sucede en esa escritura, qué sucede en la escritura.
So in this second part, it is important to pay attention to what happens when you revisit the previous work done through or in relation to this concept of regurgitation.
Sí, y por lo tanto voy pasando por esos 4 estómagos, rumen, omaso, abomaso, retículo, esos 4 estómagos, y ahí voy tomando distintos puntos de una propuesta profundamente anticolonial, donde se ponen también en juego estas relaciones humano-animal y finalmente las distinciones naturaleza-cultura.
So through these 4 stomachs, the writings is articulated in the sense that it's profoundly anti-colonial, and it questions as well the relations between culture, nature,
humano-animal.
It's like a human-animal.
Bien, y pues creo que por aquí lo podemos ir dejando, ¿no? Y muchas gracias.
So maybe we can end the presentation here, and thanks a lot.
Yeah, muchas gracias, Lucrecia, for the presentation, and thank you, Tjaša, for the translation. And actually, we go on with you now. I would like to present you Tjaša Kancler is Serra Hunter Professor at the University of Barcelona in Spain, and is a researcher, activist, and artist. So, Tjaša, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Marina, and to everyone for inviting me to participate in this great new book, volume for radical change, and also to be part of this event. Also, thanks to Lucre. I really enjoyed that we could do this presentation together. So since this online format and time I have is quite limited, I will try to highlight some of the most significant parts of my recent research work, from where I continue thinking about transformative potentialities in a new stage within a long historical decolonization processes and struggles that continue today. In the chapter I wrote for this book entitled Trans Films and Decolonization, I focus on cinematic languages. So it's maybe in this sense a bit more specific to the field, I want to say. So I focused on cinematic languages that address discrimination, epistemic violence, and erasure to emphasize what is at stake here. Imperial colonial knowledge, Eurocentrism, and racism interwoven in the universal notions of the binary gender system, and those cinematic languages that alter the established narratives to continue building vocabularies for radical change. To highlight the political in the production and construction of filmic images and their material configuration, the counter history of film, the relations between trans and decolonization, I first referred to some of the films produced by the most significant positions from Eastern Europe and the former Yugoslavia. In their experimental video, feature film, and documentary format, they span also different time periods, the 1980s, 1990s, and post-2001. So in the context of the current war and crisis situation in Europe and globally, the European Union migration, necropolitics, the imposition of hierarchies through citizenship status, and the multiplication of internal and external borders that are constitutive of the global division of labor, our theoretical, artistic, and activist work demands us to confront colonial capitalism and address rising racism and fascism with great concern. So in terms of decolonial theory and practice in former Eastern Europe, in the article I write about that over the past decades, there was is an increasing number of debates, conferences, summer workshops, publications on decolonial theory and practice that have been taking place and addressing our positioning and issues related to processes of racialization. As foregrounded by the editors Manolova, Loloc, and Kusic in a special issue of Diversia, Decolonial Theory and Practice in Southeastern Europe, published in 2018, there are three intertwined points of discussion which I think they are crucial here. First, former Eastern Europe in terms of coloniality or subordination to the West. Second, coloniality and racism in the former Eastern Europe. Their investment in racialized, Eurocentric and ethnocentric notions of progress and civilization that have produced the historical stratifications of orientalizing practices and notions, exclusionary and violent effects, both during socialist period and after. And the third, the Marxist legacy, its contradictions and potentials for present struggles against necro or turbo neoliberal capitalism. So all these debates are related to the emergence of decolonial option in the 1990s by Modernity, Coloniality, Decoloniality Research Group, whose founding members links colonial history to capitalism. And this emphasis on the structural, constitutive, and not the derivative relations through the assertion of intersectionality are in fact the analytical methods previously introduced by Black Marxists and Black feminists and further developed together with feminists of color. And in terms of trans and politics since the 1990s also, there is the emerging field of transgender studies. Trans scholars with diverse theoretical backgrounds have been contributing to a heterogeneous set of methodologies, reflexive understandings and interpretations of the meaning of the embodiment. And in this evolving debate about what trans film is, since the term trans is subject to constant shifts and redefinitions, and is not always the term people use to describe gender embodiment, Susan Stryker explains that trans logic of cinematic embodiment has been at work since the film's inception. So while in public discourse, as Nat Rahab writes, the visibility of trans issues is increasing through positive media representation and trans celebrities combined with demands for depathologization and legal rights for transgender people, the differentiation of livable trans and gender non-conforming lives along the lines of race, ethnicity, class, gender, disability, and migration status remains firmly and increasingly in place. So here is for me the crucial quotation by Hayward and Gosset, and I quote them: "Trans, so it's not necessarily a progressive mechanism for revealing cultures of violence. Rather, the formation of trans is always part of the way sex and gender are inscribed to manage, conceal, reinforce, displace, and the effects and histories of race and racism." So in this relation, I want to bring together like these 2 points, decolonial critique and trans critique, but through reading sideways, and also in relation to the film. As Somerville and Cvar write in referring to this methodology of reading sideways, it means linking seemingly disconnected and often disjointed moments and their effects in ways that consider the interconnected histories of racial, gendered, sexual, and other bio-necropolitical formations and arrangement, as well as tactics of resistance. So by looking at the history of film from the perspective of conflict, or more specifically, social struggles against racial capitalism, we can translocally relate the politicized audiovisual practices that span throughout most of 20th, 21st centuries. There is the legacy of long, diverse, and international histories of militant film, visual politics, and strategies of resistance that tell us what it means to make films decolonial. This counter-hegemonic cinematic practice raises the question of the extent to which we are able to relocate the conflict, the social contradictions in audiovisual works and make film once again an explicitly political and revolutionary practice. So the transformative potential then lied not in trans, but in its relations to decolonization, to decolonial modes of thought, sense, action, and imagination. And again, I want to quote Hayward and Gosset, who argue that white anthropocentrism is the core of racial capitalism, and decolonization is a radical upending of a world organized by the entanglement of speciesism, anti-blackness, colonialism, and capitalism. So these are crucial statements and an important shift because they break with wide framing of trans politics, take it beyond liberal positions and place it in the context and historical legacy of anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, black, eco-feminist, queer, trans, migrant, militant films and struggles. And this is also what we need to continue working on from Eastern Europe and former Yugoslavia to reject the logic of West-East repetition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tjaša, and actually you brought us back with this core of white anthropocentrism being central to processes of racialization, to Liliana, starting point of the white supremacy and the critique of the white supremacy that actually rearranged the whole space on the relation of US and Mexico. So thank you very much. And I think we continue with Saša Kesić.
Yes, we continue with Saša Kesić. Saša, are you with us? Saša is an art teacher and independent researcher from Belgrade. So, Saša, the word is yours.
Thank you. So for radical change in Serbia at the beginning of the third decade of 21st century, I chose 3 case studies: Srebrenica, rehabilitation of the fascists, and monument to Stefan Nemanja. So the Srebrenica genocide took place on July 11th, 1995. At that time, the Serbian army led by General Ratko Mladić killed 8,372 Muslim men and boys. And 25 years later, one of the prominent representatives of the Serbian left, director Zlatko Paković created the play Srebrenica, When Will the Killed Rise Up, in order to remind the Serbian public of a couple of important facts. So the first one is that academics, poets, writers, and priests, that is, culture elite of the Srebrenica genocide, are still the most prominent people in this society, Serbian society, considering that the whole set of politicians from the 90s positioned around Slobodan Milošević is still in power now, 22 years after his departure from power and 16 years after his death. And the second thing is that genocide policy continues to be pursued through genocidal culture. And I will explain this. There is one Paković documentary from 2009 in which is presented Muslim population on the bridge in Visegrad. And he says that in May 1992 in Visegrad, then with a 2/3 Muslim population, Serb military forces committed the horrific crime of killing 3,000 Bosnian civilians. So there was not only Srebrenica. And further on the film, two women give interviews about their brother and husband, who Milan Lukic abducted on May 26th, 1992. And through DNA analysis, bones of one of them were found in a mass grave between Dobrun and Visegrad, and for another one, it is still not discovered. So 20 years after this event, after this massacre and crime, in 2012, director Emir Kusturica built on the same place, Andrićgrad or Kamengrad, the stone town, the new cultural center of Visegrad, not far from the bridge. Just to mention, Ivo Andrić was a writer who received the Nobel Prize in 1961 for his novel The Bridge on Drina, originally published in 1945, in which he mainly dealt with life in Bosnia under the Ottoman Empire. So the bridge from the novel is exactly the bridge in Visegrad and the bridge from the movie. And in Andrićgrad, there are about 50 buildings, the municipal theater, a modern cinema, municipal administration, the Academy of Fine Arts, the building of the Andrić Gymnasium, hotel, squares, church, etc. And here we see also on the day opening, the ceremony of this part of the city, there was Milorad Dodik, then president of Republika Srpska, and today the Serbian member of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kusturica, director, and president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić. So just to mention, Republika Srpska or Serb Republic is not a state, but instead of self-proclaimed territory, entity that declares full autonomy despite being part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Emir Kusturica, also to mention, paying tribute to Radovan Karadžić. He was the first president of Republika Srpska, who, like Mladić, was sentenced to life imprisonment, created the verse, "One who does not like Dabić Raša should suck our dick." So Paković asked the question, why does Andrićgrad exist? And I'm quoting, not only to sully the name of Andrić and use it for a heartless purpose, but also because across the bridge, there is now an academy where followers of all generations will come to talk about culture, to create a culture. And it is the continuation of war, but other means the continuation of genocidal politics with genocidal culture, end of quote. The second case is Dimitri Eliot. He was a Serbian and Yugoslav fascist politician who cooperated with the German occupation authorities during World War II. And in 1941, he founded the Serbian Volunteering Command, popularly known as Ljotićevci, which greatest crime was their participation in the massacre in Kragujevac during 3 days in October 1941, when 2,831 people were shot in retaliation of 10 German soldiers killed and 26 wounded. German commander Franz Böhme gave orders to shoot 100 people for 1 German soldier killed. So now it is believed that the most famous phrase of the 90s of the current president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, said in the Serbian parliament a few days after the genocide in Srebrenica, so in August 1995, was inspired by part of the Nazi commander's order. So Vučić said, I'm quoting, "For every killed Serb we will kill 100 Muslims." End of quote. At the traditional celebration day of the victory over fascism on May 19, so last year in 2021, at the National Theatre in Belgrade, an institution of the highest national importance, President Aleksandar Vučić, government ministers and Milorad Dodik heard, among others, the first and last stanzas of the march used by Ljotićevci. So these stanzas were cleverly inserted between the songs of the Serbian anti-fascist poets. It was recited in such a way that it was almost impossible to know where one song ends and another begins, so that millions of television viewers were deceived by the suggestion that the authors were only those whose names appeared on the screen. And so the march of the fascist Ljotić phalanxes were grafted onto a famous poems by Desanka Maksimović, Bloody Fairy Tale, about the shooting of students in Kragujevac, which Ljotić comrades executed. In other words, on the day of victory over fascism, a gathering of fascist propaganda was held in the name of anti-fascism. And this story also takes us back to the 90s, where historical revisionism and rehabilitations of Chetniks started. Chetniks were members of Serbian nationalist guerrillas force formed during World War II to resist the Axis invaders and Croatian collaborators, but that primarily fought a civil war against the Yugoslav communist guerrillas, the partisans. The main creator of Serbian nationalism and thus historical revisionism is certainly the Serbian Orthodox Church. And according to Aleksandar Sekulović, who speaks on behalf of the Alliance of Anti-Fascists of Serbia, I'm quoting, to justify the crimes committed by Serbs in Croatia and Bosnia in the 90s, the Serbian Orthodox Church launched the hoax that they were committed by communists who, not being members of the Orthodox religions, were not Serbs. End of quote. So the third case is monument to Stefan Nemanja, dedicated to the great prefect Stefan Nemanja, the ancestor of Serbian medieval Nemanjić dynasty. So the monument, with a weight of 80 tons and the height of 23.5 meters, that is the highest monument of the territory of Serbia, was erected at the beginning of Nemanjina Street on Sava Square in Belgrade, in front of the former building of main railway station. The unveiling of the monument took place on St. Sava Day, January 27th, 2021, so last year, in the presence of many citizens and representatives of the state. Why was it dedicated to build a monument to Stefan Nemanja? Well, certainly not because Stefan Nemanja has any significance in the history of Belgrade. It was built, in my opinion, so that Vučić would make us all descendant of the monument and himself, because he is the one who brought the forgotten Nemanja out of the abyss of oblivion for what Nemanja was in the Middle Ages, Vučić is today. So with rich gifts from the state treasury, at his free disposal, he goes before church dignitaries, visits Mount Athos and gives Hilandar money from citizens, shows concerns from the church approval, and indirectly chooses who will succeed the patriarch's throne, etc. Why at the Sava Square? Because it has been in decline since the Milosevic era, and it was high time to fix it. Since the 80s of the 19th century, the main railway station has been located on this square, the symbol of Belgrade's modernization in the form of its connection with the world. Unfortunately, in July 2018, after 134 years, Vučić closed the station and prepared it for the staging of the monument of megalomaniac dimensions to a completely inappropriate urban space. How much did it cost? We don't know that still. There is still nothing in the media about the cost of making the monument, casting it, bringing it from Russia, preparing the site and assembling it. From Russia, because the construction of the monument was entrusted to the Russian sculptor Alexander Rukavishnikov, which was certainly not a consequence of the artistic offer, but a political decision, considering that the political campaigns of the Serbian Progressive Party often refer to Russia. And what is the most important detail regarding the content of the monument? Although the first presentation of the conceptual design of the monument envisaged that the great prefect would hold the cross, it was later decided that it would be a sword. There are many explanations about when and why this substitution by the replacement of the city authorities took place, among which I would like to list the one that the deputy mayor of Belgrade, Goran Vesić, wrote on his Facebook profile on the day of the unveiling of the monument. I'm quoting, the sword in the hands of Stefan Nemanja is not a conquering sword, because Saint Sava is not a conquering belief or ideology. It is a spiritual sword of truth that still disturbs those who are against Saint Sava, Simeon Nemanja, Serbian Orthodoxy, and the Serbian Church. End of quote. And finally, how are these three cases related to necropolitics? Srebrenica is clear. According to Membe, in the case of massacres, lifeless bodies are quickly reduced to the status of stateless skeletons. When it comes to revisionism, we are talking about the relation between terror, freedom, and sacrifice. So one Chetnik is finally free to live his own life only because one partisan is free to die his own death in post-communism. And in the case of Stefan Nemanja, the power and value of the body monument result from a process of abstraction based on Vučić's desire for eternity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you for this wonderful survey through those three cases, which actually lead us from this cultural elite, as you say, that is in denial of a genocide, to that actually turns into a genocidal culture. I think it's brilliant. As you have a possibility to hear, we all have a great opportunity to hear, all contributions deal with broad themes of racialization, extraction, subjectivities, violence, time, realities, death, flesh, epistemologies, fetishism, and last but not least, access and threshold. All these critical writings, as we also had opportunity to hear, transcend the boundaries of the comfort zone of academic writing, both in content and form. And those topics that are covered include trans, technology, contagion, capitalism, necropolitics, performativity, and political economy. And one thing is for sure, that this volume is not without a history of relations. It is an upgrade of various discursive research collaborations.
Yes, to me, just stay, not to say more than first thank the speakers of today, all those who actually join us. And I would like to mention the names once again: Lucrecia, Masson, Córdoba, Nina Cvar, Liliana, Conlisk, Gallegos, Tjaša Kancler, Saša Kesić, Stanimir Panayotov, and Šefik Tatlić. I'm very grateful for this possibility. I would like also to thank the public on the other side that resisted. Some are still with us here, and I'm very thankful. I know that between digital screens is not easy to follow, but on the other side is a super important possibility for us to understand that doesn't matter if you speak from US, Mexico, or from Russia, from Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, or from Slovenia, or from Spain. Practically the lines of necropolitics are present. They are brutal, they are telling, they are violent, they are not only symbolic, as we would like to think, descriptive, but they are really extractive and genocidal. And so this was the idea of all presentations, to motivate others to take the book, to go through the 24 writers and 23 texts in the book, and to maybe open a possibility for what I said in the start, a possibility of change. That it seems so far away, but we never know. Maybe every possibility even to think differently is already in the situation that we live, a possibility to change. So thank you very much to you all. Thank you for the technical support to this fantastic group of people who recorded and took care of our internet connection. And yes, see you for the next presentation.